Thanks for tuning in to the WingSpace Podcast. This podcast is not a replacement for mental health treatment or professional health care. In case of crisis or emergency, please contact your local healthcare provider or dial 911.
Hey there, and welcome to the WingSpace Podcast, a place to take up space. Season 5, we are really focusing on the 5 pillars of wellness: food and nutrition, movement, sleep, stress, and relationships. And today I am joined by one of our therapists here at Hope and Healing, Kristen Wilson. She is our resident expert when it comes to couples and marriage counseling. And so Kristen, we're going to talk about relationships today.
Good morning. I am excited to talk about relationships today.
Yeah. So, as I said, a lot of the focus that you have is working with couples and with married folks. And I can imagine, as a relationship expert, if you will, that a lot of those tricks and tips and tools that you're using to engage with your couples who are in romantic and intimate relationships are very likely transferable to other kinds of relationships, friendships, peer relationships, even probably coworkers and family relationships.
Yes, absolutely. I like all the credit you're giving me for being the resident expert on this. But yes, absolutely. I say this all the time in couples counseling, especially when it comes to when I'm just talking with parents, because some of these things definitely apply when you are talking to your kids. One of the big things that comes to mind as you're talking about these things is to, and I may be jumping ahead, but I really want to share this little tidbit of information, summarizing and validating what you hear someone saying. If you find yourself in a conversation and the other person maybe is frequently repeating themselves, the odds are they're feeling unheard, and you do not have to share the perspective of what they're saying to summarize what you hear them telling you and validate some part of what they're saying. I hear that you had a really long day at work, and I can understand why that would be frustrating when you come home and things were a mess, right? Obviously that one's maybe more couples therapy related, but coworkers, kids, like, you don't have to agree with the intensity or the feeling that somebody is bringing to the table when they're discussing something. But if you're hoping to move the conversation in a different direction, sometimes just letting that person know, okay, I hear what you're saying. I can understand, even if you don't agree, right? I can understand how you would feel that way. And then taking the next step towards the next part of the conversation.
When you first started talking, Kristen, I immediately had my therapist question in my head, which was, tell me a little bit more about that, because I was like, oh, a good example. Like, let's talk about a good example. And then you just walked right into that. So thanks for sharing that. And, I think that is something that is certainly a skill that is transferable to any relationships. If you're, let's say you had to cancel lunch or dinner plans on a friend and they're frustrated, I can hear that you're frustrated, and I understand why you would be upset about our plans changing. Coworkers, if there's some kind of an interaction in the office that is difficult for someone, then just acknowledging what you are getting from them in terms of that emotion that they're kicking back, and then just validating that it's okay to have it. So I think so often we don't put ourselves in other people's shoes, therefore we don't recognize that the feeling that they have is valid. It may not be how we feel. It may not be how we think we will feel in that same situation, but it doesn't change the fact that that's the feeling that they have.
Yeah, I think sometimes when there is hesitancy to summarize and validate, it's because we think maybe that is alluding to that we're in agreement with them, or that we're giving permission in some way, or that we're even stating, I feel the same way, or, oh, I agree with you. And if we don't agree, right? I mean, certainly if you happen to agree, that's a shortcut to shared understanding, but you can deepen understanding of what somebody needs that you're in a relationship with, even if it's just someone you're sharing a pod with at work, right? We can deepen our understanding of that conversation and that relationship without agreeing. You can summarize and validate without giving up any part of how you feel or what you believe in or what your own needs are.
Your use of the example of sharing a pod with someone is quite timely, in that we are in the week of return to work for a lot of our government employees. And I hope that if there are any of them who are listening to this, number one, I can fully understand frustrations, annoyances, anger, sadness, the full array of emotions. But I can imagine that there's going to be some tensions within those office settings as people have their own thoughts and emotions going into it, but they're also now having to navigate how to work in the same space with people that for potentially the last 5 years they haven't had to. I mean, we're a month away from 5 years of since COVID, when so many of these folks went home to work and they jumped onto a Google Meet or a Zoom or a Teams or something like that, rather than having a coworker right next to them. So, any thoughts on some nuggets for our folks who are returning to work in terms of how to manage those relationships potentially as they change?
I think that the likely scenario, anytime there's a large change, right? A likely scenario that often plays out is it's easier for people to all feel in the same boat during that like initial adjustment phase, right? Maybe everybody had that same bad commute to work. Maybe everybody, doesn't have what they need at their desk because they didn't think to bring it because they haven't been there in a bit. Or just the sadness of your old routine, right? And missing that. There is a lot of commonality in those feelings, week one or beginning of this happening. Sometimes it is harder to have the same amount of understanding and grace for that sort of next phase of building your routine. If you're now in a setting with a lot of people who are building routines after that initial adjustment of getting back into the office setting, the next phase is everyone's building routines. That might be where you find your routine or desired routine clashes a little bit with, somebody in your workspace. And so reminding yourself that you can give yourself grace and give the other people, in your space grace as you adjust to these routines, but also that you can speak about what your needs are. Should you happen to have somebody next to you that plays their music really loud, giving grace doesn't mean accepting that from now till forever you have to listen to loud music. Giving grace looks like, how can I approach this without blaming, without criticism, but just sharing what my own need is. In couples counseling, I pull so many tools from the Gottmans. And one of them is a gentle startup. This has a lot of transferable usage, but it is stating how you feel about whatever the situation is and what you need from it. And you can share, with your coworker, I feel overwhelmed about adjusting back to the office and all the noises and the events and things going on, all the talking and the people. I need to create a little bit of quiet at my own desk. Could you please turn down your music a bit? Or would you mind using headphones? Giving grace doesn't mean putting your own needs aside. Giving grace just means approaching it with the idea of compromise or thoughtfulness and trying to leave out the blame and criticism piece of things.
Well, and using the example of our government employees and our contractual employees returning back to work, there's probably a lot of mixed thoughts about it as well. And, it seems like in this world that we live in, everything gets, polarized from a political perspective. So there's lots of opinions and then there's lots of emotions that come with that. So finding ways to be able to have those conversations in professional yet meaningful ways that don't create divides within workplaces, because goodness knows there's enough division in our world right now. We don't need to create more in these workplaces where people are doing such great work. You mentioned, for our listeners, this is mine and Kristen's take 2 of this episode. We, I think got about, 9 to 10 minutes in last week. And then I lost internet here in Leonardtown. So we just said, okay, we'll try again next week. And so I'm going to put you on the spot, Kristen, because in our episode that we recorded last week, you mentioned this idea of having flexibility, understanding, and insight with regards to communication and relationships. And you've kind of already touched on those ideas, especially when we talk about understanding someone else's perspective and giving grace. Grace kind of translates to flexibility. Thoughts on those ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you're talking about personal relationships, and I am going to give the sort of disclaimer that when I say personal relationships, I am not referring to any relationship where there might be a safety concern or any sort of element of being unsafe present in that. I'm talking more broadly about general relationships. And insight and flexibility and understanding is really going to get you a lot more success. Flexibility to compromise, right? If we are talking about coworker relationship, or if we are talking about, a family relationship, what is something, these might be my needs, this might be what they're expressing. Is there flexibility in there where we can find a common ground? Understanding is that sort of compassion towards, you are an individual, they are an individual. Makes sense that you might not always see eye to eye on things. And even though you might not see eye to eye, is this a situation where you can have understanding? And then insight. Insight is this something that is a core need for me that I'm talking about? Or is this something where I can, again, with that idea of understanding and flexibility, it's okay if it's something you feel strongly about. It's absolutely appropriate to need to set a boundary or create a situation that's different for you or communicate concern to somebody. If you can do it if you can approach it with that sort of open mind of things, the conversation will likely go a lot better, because if you have insight and understanding, you're going to have less blame and criticism, right? And having less blame doesn't mean that you don't expect someone to make a change. It doesn't mean that, there are times people need to take accountability for their actions. But if we're talking about how we navigate conversations or difficult conversations in personal relationships, gaining understanding is a really big part of that. And it's really hard to do if you go in with a really rigid frame of mind. You're not going to have as much success. And I know I keep referring to have successful conversations. What I really mean by that is if you use blame and criticism, or if you go in with a really rigid state of mind, the odds are the message you're trying to send also isn't being understood, right? So yes, it's about caring for the person that you're speaking with. This is a coworker, a friend, someone in your family. There is that sort of care and compassion in that direction. But also, it's important if there's something that you're giving thought to saying in a manner or presenting in a manner that you want to be heard, you're less likely to be heard if whoever you're talking to is distracted by blame, criticism, inflexibility, those sorts of things. So that's a really key piece of things.
Well, and I want to make sure that our listeners understand too that the relationship we have with ourselves is one that also requires us to have flexibility and understanding and insight, because we may not approach communication with other people with that shame and blame, but we might be feeling it ourselves. And so we're coming off defensive because we've already considered ourselves guilty. We've already considered ourselves at fault or wrong or whatever. And we don't have maybe insight enough to understand whether it's purposeful or accidental motivation behind and motives behind what we've done. So being flexible with ourselves and being understanding with ourselves and having insight into our own actions can be really helpful as we engage with other people.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point, because when we have all of that conversation going on internally, it absolutely affects how we're able to speak to those around us and how we're able to communicate what it is that we want or need to have a conversation about or address. One thing that I've been talking a lot about recently when it comes to relationships is the idea of the circle of control. And at the end of the day, the primary things that we can control are our own thoughts and our reactions to things and the way that we choose to feel, right? We might have an automatic response to something, but that doesn't mean that our insight has to stop there, right? If you have an automatic response that's unhelpful or not comfortable for you, seek out that better understanding and insight, because with that effort, the automatic response can change. outside of our circle of control is our circle of influence. That is where our coworker relationships come in, even our relationships with our kids and our spouse and our partner. We can influence things in those settings, but we don't have control over it. And just like you're responsible for your own thoughts and feelings, they're responsible for theirs. So you don't need to take that on. They're responsible for theirs. And then the outer circle would be the things we can't control, right? Like the weather and things like that are happening. There's so many things that are outside of our circle of control. And sometimes acknowledging that can help us make a better plan with what is in our control and help us as a reminder for creating that insight and speaking to ourselves and having compassion for ourselves in that way.
Well, and I want to remind people too, I think one of the most significant influences that would be in kind of that middle to outer circle that you talked about is the digital influence that we're consuming, right? Whether it's scrolling the web and we're seeing things on the internet or news sites or watching the news or, scrolling on social media, all of those things have influence on us. And even if we are just mindlessly scrolling, our brain is still consuming all of the headlines, consuming all of the thoughts and opinions of those that are out there. And then it creates this inner dialogue that then influences not only the way that we're talking to ourselves, but it also then impacts the way that we respond to other people. So, you may have found yourself, to our listeners, you may have found yourself in a position where you just feel so stressed and so like this internal, like volcano almost, that it just seems like it's bubbling and bubbling. And then you bite somebody's head off, or you snap at somebody in a meeting, or you're feeling overwhelmed. What is it that you're consuming? And how can you assert control over your consumption of that content so that you're not being influenced by things that are outside, right? We have no control over what's being put out there, but we have full control over what we consume, how we consume it, how often we consume it, and what we do with it, so that we're mindful of, the influence it has on us and then the way that it impacts our relationships.
That's such a great point. I think it's a good reminder to people too. It doesn't have to be black and white, right? The message I'm hearing you share, Jen, isn't that you need to avoid those things. It's more that you need to have insight to how they impact you. If you are consuming media that can leave you feeling maybe on edge or uncomfortable, then maybe your ride into work is not the time to be doing that potentially, right? I mean, to each their own. And, people have different work environments and what their plans are. But if you are feeling less than pleased about being in that setting, or if you're on your way to your kids' Little League game or whatever it is that you want to have control of your thoughts and feelings and go with an optimistic attitude, but yet you're consuming something at that time that doesn't make you feel optimistic, then saving that for a different part of your day, right? How can you set yourself up for success by using that time to consume something that influences you in the manner that you want to approach the next step with? You and I had a lengthy and very enjoyable conversation about our morning routines not that long ago. And a lot of the idea of that was, how can we set ourselves up for success? So there are things in the world that we want to learn about and know about, and that we do have opinions on and are affected by. So your message that I'm hearing you say, it's not to stop caring about those things. By all means, be involved and care, but where are you allowing it to influence your day and how? And are you setting yourself up for success for the other areas that you have to address?
It's so interesting as we talk. This idea came up a couple of years ago. I was working in a job that I guess I had about a 20 to 30 minute drive to and from work. And then I switched jobs and I had about a 2.5 mile commute, which was lovely. However, it didn't take very long for my husband and I to figure out that a 2.5 mile commute really wasn't long enough to decompress from the day. And I was coming in either on the phone with a coworker, kind of still processing and debriefing from the day, or I hadn't even gotten through a full song on the radio by the time I had gotten into the house, and I was still really feeling amped up from my day. So you're right about this whole idea of routines. And I loved our conversation we had about our morning routines, but it's really important for our listeners to understand that those routines that we engage in for our own selves have such an influence on other people around us. And, my husband and I kind of talked about, all right, when you walk out of your office and you get into your car, take a few minutes, maybe finish that conversation before you even drive out of the parking lot, and then listen to some music and kind of give yourself that, 5 to 8 minutes that it took to drive that little windy country road, so that routine could then better influence those relationships at home. And I wasn't coming home still, frustrated and annoyed and carrying everything from that day, because it has such an influence. And then my behavior became something that was out of control, but yet influencing those people in my family and in my home. And we have to be aware. We have to really be aware of all that.
Absolutely. And as you were talking about some of these like bigger relationships that we have influence over, and since this conversation is about relationships as a whole, I am going to jump around a little bit and insert an idea that I really wanted to share, which is, you talked about your routine at home with your family. Rituals of connection, again, a Gottman term I'm bringing in that applies to couples, but also applies in other relationships. These rituals of time that we have together to connect with our loved ones and what that looks like. I'm hearing how you were recognizing that influence that you were allowing to have, not having that commute anymore, negatively impacted your ritual of connection, how you came home and connected with your family at that time. Rituals of connection are so important because they are how we continue feeling connected and having understanding of our family and feeling understood and valued by our family. Rituals of connection are true in other relationships, right? If you have a friend that you call every Monday, or, you guys get together for lunch every other Friday, or whatever that looks like, rituals of connection are important in our world. There's milestones in our lives that change those, right? A really easy one to point to is if you previously didn't have kids and then you have kids, like so many of those connections that we made change. Nothing wrong with that, right? There is a necessity in it. And even if you adjust your expectations or decide this really serves me, this doesn't serve me, but maintaining some ritual of connection so that way you feel invested in these relationships, even if life gets busy, right? At some point you stop having these milestones quite as frequently to help you reflect on these rituals of connections, and they might adapt and change in a good way naturally, or they might adapt and change in a way that you're not happy with. So having insight to what does that look like? What are those rituals of connection like for you? Are they serving you? Is a good purposeful way to invest in our relationships.
I'm beginning to think that we could create a whole podcast season talking about relationships. I love this idea of rituals of connection, and also for our listeners to recognize that they come in seasons. So my husband turns into a pumpkin at 10 o'clock. He's in bed 10 o'clock every night. And so when we had children, we agreed that we were going to have this bedtime routine that put them to bed early so that we still had time in the evening to watch a show and have adult time. And, now we have teenagers, and, basically they put us to bed at 10, and then they do whatever teenagers do. Although I should give my oldest son credit because he's getting up the earliest right now and is going to bed before the rest of us. But, there was that period of time where that ritual changed. And so we all kind of said goodnight at 10 o'clock, and we went to bed, and they went to their video games or something. I don't know. But, giving ourselves permission, right? Giving ourselves grace and flexibility, having the insight to recognize that those rituals of connection are going to change as the seasons of our life change. And it's okay. It's okay that those change. We certainly miss bath and, book story time and saying our prayers and singing the songs and putting them to sleep at night. But it's also really cool to have them, driving themselves and coming home and telling us about their day while we're having dinner together and things. So the rituals change, and it's kind of cool to see it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when a ritual of connection needs to change, it's thought of as losing something. But really, and what you highlighted with that story there is by recognizing when it's changing, it doesn't have to be that you're losing something. It's just that you're continuing to invest in making it adaptable. I often tell people, if you have a routine of seeing each other for a certain amount of time or this, that, or day, and that's on your calendar, but then it can't happen because life starts to change, your demands change. Think of it as like a sticky note. It's okay if that has to adjust and move, but do not crumple up the sticky note and throw it away. Like that sticky note needs to remain on your calendar, and just the importance of that.
Well, and I even go so far as to, every month I want to, have a date night with my husband, have lunch with a friend. I have girlfriends from high school that we try to get together for dinner every month. And I just make that, it's almost like a revolving sticky note, right? These are my monthly things that I want to do that help me to remain connected with the people that are important to me. And so I just move that sticky note month to month and make sure that I'm engaging in those things. And, for our listeners, it's okay to write notes, and it's okay to, keep track of those things and to remind yourself to schedule them and to not erase them and forget to put them back on the calendar. I love that idea of moving the sticky note rather than just taking it away and crumpling it up, for sure.
Oftentimes I think, and this is a little bit of my own opinion, but it's glamorized in movies and TV shows and things like that. Well, if you really cared, you wouldn't have to plan it. Or if you really knew me, you would automatically know I feel this way. The planning is the caring, right? People change over time. My favorite, movie snack when I met my husband 20 years ago is different than what my favorite movie snack is now. And if he were to ask, what do you want from the counter when I go buy snacks, I'd be thrilled, because then it's again, deepening that understanding. It's okay for you to ask the questions of your partner to get to know them at this moment in life now. It is a good thing to put in effort to plan to see your friends. If it's not naturally happening and you have to put in effort into planning, that doesn't mean you don't care because it's not naturally happening. It means you do care, because the caring is the planning. The caring is the tending to it. That's the investment piece of it. And that effort is worthwhile.
I love that. The effort is worthwhile. The planning is the caring. That's great. As I said a little while ago, I feel like we could probably go on forever, but out of respect for your time, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Did you have any final thoughts that you just any nugget you wanted to make sure somebody took away in these final moments?
I wish I had something profound to share here, but I think I've just jumped in a lot today, so I will leave it at that. But thank you so much for having me.
As always, Kristen, thanks so much for joining me, and I appreciate your time. Listeners, thanks for listening today. As always, if you have thoughts or ideas, you can always email me, Jennifer@hopehealingtherapy.com. You can send us a message on our Instagram or Facebook, and hope you have a great day.